In parts 1 and 2, we saw how Oskar Dirlewanger fought in World War I, where, despite being badly wounded several times, he always willingly returned to the front. Despite the end of the war, he managed to bring 600 men back to Germany from occupation duties in the east. He joined Freikorps units fighting against socialist insurgents in Germany and ethnic Poles in Silesia. He was wounded once more in 1921, and this time was bad enough to get him knocked out of the paramilitary for some time. He was an early member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He went to university and got a degree. When the Nazis were granted power in 1933, like many old fighters, he was given a job. However, he seems to have resented some of the jobs given to other old fighters, jobs they clearly weren't capable of doing. This caused jealousy, and Dirlewanger found himself being investigated for rape amongst other charges. He went to prison and on getting out decided to go to Spain, fighting the war there. His old friend from World War I, Gottlob Berger, took him under his wing. Berger by this time was high up in the National Socialist administration. Berger arranged for him to head a special unit to do particularly dirty tasks. This unit was involved in crimes against Jewish people, first of all in the Lublin area and then in the Lwów area. After the outbreak of serious partisan activity in what is today Belarus in the winter of 1941-42, he was sent there. This unit was involved in the anti-partisan fight, which is another way of saying butchering local civilians. In July 1944, the Eastern Front totally collapsed. From a starting point very approximately equivalent to the eastern border of Belarus today, the Red Army tore apart Army Group Center and raced forward, held back only by its lack of supplies and supported by partisans which harassed, cut off and demoralised German stragglers. Dirlewanger's unit, operating behind the lines, got out before the army did, but such was the speed of the Red Army that many of them were caught up in the fighting. The unit suffered at least 80 losses. By the end of the month, Dirlewanger found himself back in Germany, in Lwów, today Elk in East Prussia. By the 27th of July 1944, Soviet advance units had reached Garwolin to the east of Warsaw, and in the south, in the region of Magniuszew, had crossed the river Vistula. The breaching of the wide Vistula must have horrified the Army High Command, although it needs to be pointed out that whereas the river is wide, it's not very deep. Indeed, I have seen somebody walk across it just south of Warsaw. The German authorities in Warsaw were in total panic. Evacuation started. There were some German reserves in the region of Skierniewice and Żeradów. Whether or not they would be any good was yet to be seen. At 10 o'clock that morning, the High Command of the Polish Home Army met. Should they order an uprising in Warsaw or not? Opinions were divided. The opinion of Tadeusz Komorowski, commanding officer of the Home Army, was that Warsaw should free itself. Around midday, Colonel Antony Chruściel, commanding the Warsaw Military District for the Polish Home Army, held his final meeting with his closest advisors. Probably now in total panic at around 1700 hours, the German authorities, using megaphones, started to order the civilian population to report for work digging trenches under the fortifications. The order was that 100,000 people aged between 17 and 65 should report the following morning at 1000 hours. This worried the Home Army decision makers. In these circumstances, their own troops could find themselves in a position where they could not report to their muster areas. Chruściel, without consulting the High Command, gave orders for the Home Army to mobilise. These orders reaching units the following morning. Within hours, there were thousands of people waiting for the order to launch an insurrection. Very few people obeyed the order of the occupation authorities to report for work on the 28th of July. Surprisingly for many, the Nazis didn't respond. In view of this, the Home Army decided not to give the order for the uprising to start. At 1600 hours, Chruściel gave the orders to stand down. By the morning of the 29th of July 1944, it seems as though some German units had begun to calm down. Sappers mined the bridges over the Vistula and prepared defences. Street patrols were stepped up. Komorowski now wanted to start the uprising at 1700 hours, but Khrushchev said that 12 hours notice would be needed, and so it was put off. On Sunday, the 30th of July 1944, the Red Army was reported to be in the eastern suburbs of Warsaw. Despite the presence of German patrols, the underground press started to become available openly on the streets of the capital. Knowing what was about to happen, the Polish Prime Minister in exile in London, Stanisław Mikołajczyk, flew to Moscow to speak to Stalin. In view of the threat to the Polish capital, Hitler nominated Rainer Stachel to be the military commandant of Warsaw. Stachel had earlier been appointed to be the commandant at Wilno and had rescued a large number of trapped German soldiers surrounded by the Red Army. He was therefore the hero of the hour and a man Hitler considered would hold Warsaw. His orders were to hold the line. He arrived in Warsaw on the 31st of July 1944. The High Command of the Polish Home Army took the decision not to start the uprising the following day. However, given the news of the capture of the leaders of the German 73rd Division and the presence of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division on the eastern bank of the Vistula, the Home Army High Command changed its mind. At 17:30 hours, Khrushchev noted that the Red Army was now in the eastern suburbs of Warsaw. The order was given for an armed uprising to begin the following day, the 1st of August 1944. However, due to the curfew, not everyone got the order on time, which was not coded until 2000 hours. The mobilization orders were for 40 to 45,000 people to attack previously selected targets in occupied Warsaw. However, the lack of time meant that there was a shortage of arms. In some places, enthusiasm to attack the Germans was so great that fighting started ahead of time. At 1400 hours in the northern district of Żoliborz, units of the Home Army were shooting at Germans. By 1600 hours, this has spread to the western district of Wola and the city centre. This is ulica Sowińskiego in the Wola district, which is to the west of Warsaw. Here, at this location, on the 1st of August 1944, 8 passers-by were shot by the Nazi occupiers, making the very first victims of the Warsaw Uprising. The people who were shot here were shot in revenge for a firefight which had taken place a little earlier. It would seem that there were Home Army fighters on their way to their muster points. Now, it must have been literally tens of thousands of people who knew that at 5 o'clock on the 1st of August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising was due to start. And as a result, it must have been very difficult to keep the secret. Indeed, there must have been people so keen to get their hands on the German occupiers that they wanted to start it up earlier. What actually happened with the firefight, I cannot say. And did the Germans know that the Warsaw Uprising was about to take place? The intelligence services must have known, I would have thought, but I can't answer that question. I don't really know. In any case, the Germans were taken by surprise. As far as this is concerned, this was one of very many street executions which took place. The first large street execution in a public area took place in October 1943 after the death of the head of the SS and police in the Warsaw district, Franz Kuchnera. These large-scale shootings actually stopped. Having said that, though, people had been killed en masse in the ruins of the Warsaw ghetto, which is of course off bounds to most people. The people who were shot here being the first victims of an uprising which hadn't yet started. Of the 30,000 who were successfully mobilized, only around 3,000 had weapons. On the German side, there were around 20,000 men in Warsaw, half of which were regular troops, the others being police and support units. Headquarters of the Home Army was set up in the Victoria Hotel, but it had little control over the fighting. Individual units attacked what they could. The result was that some important positions and supply stores remained in German hands. However, amongst successes for the Home Army should be included the food and uniform supplies that were captured in the region of Ulica Stawki. However, important points such as the bridges across the Vistula, the main railway stations, the airport and most barracks remained in German hands. Despite the warnings and the amount of people who knew about the mobilization, it would seem that the German forces were taken completely by surprise. By the evening of the 1st of August 1944, Rainer Stachel reported that he'd lost around 500 troops and estimated that the rebels had lost around 2,000. Not everyone on the German side was surprised. Wilhelm Kopper, the higher SS and police leader for the general government, had been warning of it since the middle of July, and he even knew the name of the commanding officer of the Home Army, Tadeusz Komorowski. Before I continue, I need to point out that whereas I'm going to attempt to give a chronological account of what happened, we're relying on, to a large extent, on accounts made after the war, and these accounts sometimes contradict each other. This, I think, is due to people trying to remember events on days that may have run into each other when they weren't taking notes, and one day seems just the same as every other day. It needs to be remembered that many of the main players were dead by the time the war ended, whereas others wanted to hide their own activities, fearing trials. Therefore, accounts differ, and I could change my mind in the future about these chronological details. By the 2nd of August 1944, realising that many objectives had not been taken, some Polish commanders withdrew their forces either to the Campinos forest to the northwest of the capital or to the Kabacki forest in the south. In the eastern suburb of Praga, the revolt was put down quite quickly. Meanwhile, Rainer Stachel was appealing for support and Hitler was prepared to give it. In the Situation Conference held in the early morning of the 2nd of August 1944, Hitler, only 2 weeks after the attempt on his life, was in no mood to compromise. He ordered Himmler to destroy everything and everyone. Later that day, Himmler flew to Posen, today Poznan. It appears as though on the 3rd of August 1944, the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, was responsible for the nomination of Heinz Reinefeld as the person to put down the Warsaw Uprising. Reinefeld was then the higher SS and police leader of the Reichsgau Vaterland and based in occupied Poznan. It is difficult to guess why Reinefeld was chosen, perhaps because he had a good reputation as a frontline soldier at the time. On the other hand, in 1944, military professionalism was no longer required as much as in 1940. It should be remembered that Reinefeld's only military experience until then was as a non-commissioned officer and as a lieutenant in the Wehrmacht. He had no experience in the staff and, for that matter, no training. At that time, what mattered in the Third Reich was ideological stability, perceived courage and boldness. People considered ideologically secure were often elevated to high military positions. Reinefeld is a good example of this. In the first days of August 1944, he improvised heavily. He gathered police units from the Warthegau, which, together with other forces such as Oskar Dirlewanger Sonderkommando, went to Warsaw. In order to reach the centre of the city, they marched in from the west. On the evening of the 3rd of August 1944, Reinefeld reported to the command post of the 9th Army under the General of the Panzer Troops Nicholas von Wollmann, which was stationed near Warsaw. He was initially subordinate to this unit. During the next day, he familiarised himself with the situation in Warsaw and consulted with those around him. Dirlewanger probably did not arrive in Warsaw for some days, but part of his command was there very quickly. Dirlewanger travelled from Lwów to Warsaw via Sochachev. On paper, SS Standartenführer Oskar Dirlewanger had 2 battalions, but in reality had only 16 officers and 865 men. However, he received reinforcements from a penal unit. This is what remains of the former SS detention camp at Danzig Matow. It's located in the hills to the west of the centre of Gdansk. Today, very little remains of it, and if you want to see it, you're going to have to do it quickly. The camp was set up initially as a barracks for the local SS, but in time it evolved into being the main camp where offenders from the SS were punished. The idea was to isolate them from other prisoners. After all, once their sentence was served, the idea was to send them back to their units, and so Himmler didn't want them to mix with the other types of prisoner in the concentration camps. Prisoners of the camp included the SS and in some cases also the police, but not regular army soldiers. I've done several videos on the camp at Danzig Matow and links will be provided below. It was from here, at Danzig Matow, that Dirlewanger received a contingent of 1,500 men. The prisoners could earn their release through service with his unit, but they couldn't refuse to go. In the following days, Dirlewanger received a further 600 men. Dirlewanger's unit was further strengthened when he was assigned a 3rd Battalion, the 2nd Azerbaijani Battalion Bergman, made up of Red Army prisoners who had changed sides. On the 5th of August 1944, the activities of the unit were reported to the Commander-in-Chief of the 9th Army. On that day, SS Obergruppenführer Erich von Debach received orders from Hitler to suppress the uprising. He was directly subordinate to Himmler and was given supreme command of all German troops in Warsaw. The core group was named von Debach. His first general staff officer was the later SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Krull. The corps initially consisted of the Kampfgruppe Rheinefort and the Kampfgruppe Rohr, formed on the 2nd of August 1944 and led by Major General Gunther Rohr. Von Debach also had numerous smaller Wehrmacht units, mostly in division or battery strength. This included artillery, infantry, assault engineer and armoured infantry troops. A field replacement battalion of the Hermann Goering Parachute Panzer Division was available for support. Later he was also assigned the 19th Panzer Division under Lieutenant General Hans Kallner. The second part of the Rheinefort group were units of the Ordnungspolizei which had been sent from Poznan. This force, known as the Posen Group, had originally consisted of 16 gendarmerie units from Poznan, Gniezno, Rawicz, Pabianice and other cities. Due to losses, it had to be reduced to 2 police regiments with a total of 12 companies. The Poznan troops also included a company from the SS Junker School Braunschweig from Posen-Tresgau. These units, which totaled almost 3,000 men, were inadequately equipped with heavy weapons. Finally, the group was also assigned to the Security Regiment 608 of the 203rd Security Division with its 3 battalions consisting of 20 officers and around 600 men and non-commissioned officers under Colonel Willy Schmidt. The soldiers of this unit had been deferred from frontline service because of their age and were also not at all suitable for the house-to-house fighting which was to follow. Rheinefort's task was clear. It was not supposed to be just a military action because the Home Army was not recognised by the Germans as a legitimate army. It was a punitive action against the uprising to make an example of those who had dared to resist the Third Reich. The fate of Warsaw was to radiate to the entire Eastern Front. The lesson was to be, any resistance will be broken with brutality. No distinction was made between people who fought and civilians. Hence Himmler's order to Rheinefort and the other pacifiers of the Warsaw Uprising was to kill everyone unless they were Germans. Rheinefort, marching in from the west, carried out this command. Tens of thousands of people living in the largely working-class district of Wola were butchered. On the 5th of August 1944, in a telephone conversation with General Nicholas von Vormann, Rheinefort uttered, "What should I do with the civilians? I have less ammunition than prisoners." The objective was to punch a line through Warsaw to open up the communication lines to the bridges over the Vistula River, which would allow supplies to reach the Eastern Front. The most westerly district of Warsaw was that of Wola. Dirlewanger and his unit again showed their cruelty and brutality, which was extraordinary even for the SS. Warsaw offered possibilities that the poor villages in the marshes of Belarus could not offer. A seemingly endless supply of alcohol, women and things to steal. Mass shootings, torture of prisoners, looting, rape, crimes against children, alcohol, which even Dirlewanger himself got involved with. These crimes were documented by eyewitnesses, mainly from members of the Wehrmacht. The account that one hears about Dirlewanger's unit is that most of them were constantly drunk. They appear to spend more time attacking civilians than armed insurgents, and was more of a follow-on unit than a fighting unit. However, in places it did combat the insurgents, but used tactics such as using civilians as human shields when attacking enemy positions. The amount of people killed by Dirlewanger's unit is not known, but it must run into tens of thousands. This is the Sininsky Park in the Wola district to the west of Warsaw. It's named after this gentleman up here, Józef Sowinski, who died in September 1831 fighting the Russians. This park dates to 1936. It was built on the orders of the mayor Stefan Starzyński, who later was to be murdered by the Nazis. It was the first park in Warsaw, I think, that was opened after Poland became independent. This was an area of working class area. Wola was built largely during the 19th century as a place thanks to the growth of the railway lines, and this encouraged industrial development. In fact, on this very park's built up of three things in particular. There was a Tsarist fortification that was over here. Also there were brickworks and a clay pit, and it was built up from using all three of these things. Now, during the battles for Warsaw in 1939, there was a fort in this area, an old Tsarist fortification. We can still see some of the ramparts for it today, and that held up the tanks from the 9th until the 27th of September, I think it was. And this being here, the road which is just down there, that is one of the main arteries into Warsaw. Also, being the main artery into Warsaw, it brought about death and destruction in a terrible way during the Warsaw insurrection. 1st of August 1944, there was the revolt in Warsaw, trying to overthrow the Nazi regime, which had been here for almost 5 years. 5 years of terror in the Polish capital. But what happened was Hitler passed orders to Himmler to destroy everything and everybody, and those that were destroying everything, everybody, collected in Poznan, sent here, and then there was this march through the district of Wola to start off with, and then until they got to the centre of Warsaw. Here we have a monument which recalls what actually happened here. Some 1,500 people were shot in this area, in this park. So from a new park built in 1936 for the working class inhabitants of Wola, which provided them with such things as a children's playground, amphitheatre, activities like were today even, and we can still see that there was some type of fete going on here, and well, so the toilets are still here indeed. From this sort of a area for the use by people, a popular area, and then it became a place of mass destruction of people. And the reason that they were killed was because they were Polish. They just killed everybody, the Nazis. They didn't care if they were fighters or not. Indeed, with the case of Dirlewanger, it's clear that these renegade units, made up of largely from Soviet citizens, Russians and others, they preferred to just kill unarmed civilians than to fight armed rebels. Indeed, the armed rebels weren't armed particularly well. Very little in the way of weapons and ammunition for that. Some 6,000 bodies were burned here, according to the sign that we have there. 6,000 people who were murdered in their houses, told to come out of the houses, shot outside in the street, some hospitals where they just killed everybody, bodies brought here, and then they were burnt at this location. Now, there's another thing as well from the terror point of view. You can see the statue there. There's a photograph with a 600 millimeter cannon, the Karlgeräte. There was only 7 of them built during the Second World War, and it stood somewhere around here, and that's judging by the photograph. This then fired shells weighing approximately 2,170 kilos, which could make it a 15-meter crate, and with a depth of up to 5 meters, depending on what it was that they actually hit when they landed. Some of the shells were duds, as it turned out, because there's even photographs of Home Army sappers making them safe. And so that was based here, and there was only 7 of these things were actually manufactured, and 4 of them were sent to Warsaw. The first one arrived during the second week of the uprising. More were sent later, but there wasn't 4 here at the same time, because there was problems with the barrel with the first one. I'll do a separate video on that later. I will quote from the recollections of one person who was under Dirlewanger's command. In 2002, the German television channel ZDF made a documentary called Matti Shanks' letzte Reise nach Polen, Matti Shanks' last journey to Poland. It was directed by Dietrich Schubert. In 1944, Matthias Schenk was an 18-year-old Belgian who served as an assault engineer in the Wehrmacht during the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising. He came from part of Belgium that had been part of Germany prior to World War I, and whereas parts of his family were in the resistance, he had been conscripted. In Warsaw, he had the bad luck to be assigned to SS Sturmbrigade Dirlewanger. His unit had arrived in Warsaw on the 1st of August 1944. Entering the city, it was cut off and a small group of them were surrounded. It was Dirlewanger who broke through to them. Matthias Schenk described it thus: "Then a SS unit arrived. They looked strange. They had no ranks on their uniforms and reeked of vodka. They attacked instantly, screaming, 'Hurrah!' and were dying by dozens. Their commander, dressed in a black leather coat, was raging in the back, pushing his men to attack. A tank arrived. We rushed with the SS troopers behind it. A few meters from the buildings the tank was hit. It exploded and a soldier's hat flew high up. We ran away again. The second tank was hesitating. We were covering the front as the SS men were rushing civilians out of their homes and positioning them around the tank, forcing some of them to sit on the armour. For the first time in my life I saw such a thing. They were hurrying a Polish woman in a long coat. She was holding a little girl in her arms. People crowded onto the tank were helping her to climb up. Someone took the girl. When he was handing her back to the mother, the tank started moving forward. The child fell down under the tracks and got crushed. The woman was screaming in terror. One of the SS men frowned and shot the woman in the head. They continued driving. Those who tried to escape were killed by the SS men. The attack was successful. The Poles were retreating. We chased them. Behind us, civilians were getting out of the cellars with their arms up. They were screaming, "Nicht partisan!" I didn't see what was happening because we were exchanging fire with the Poles, but I heard as the SS commander in the leather coat was shouting to his men to kill everyone, including women and children. Later, Shanks learned that the SS man in the black coat was Oskar Dirlewanger. Then in the cellars of Warsaw we were calling him the Butcher, silently, because the way to the grave in his unit was short. He had a habit of hanging people every Thursday. Poles are his own people, for absolutely nothing. Very often he himself kicked the chairs from under the victims' feet. After a few days of fighting we were assigned to Dirlewanger. 3 assault engineers for each SS platoon. Our job was to make way for the SS men, blow up all obstacles and doors. We were jumping into houses and chasing out people. We were under Dirlewanger's command. Always in the front. Run, place the explosive and after detonation jump into the building. We were followed by Dirlewanger's horde. They looked like bums. Dirty and shredded uniforms. Not all of them had weapons. They took them from the dead. Every morning they got vodka. We, the assault engineers, did too. We were drinking on an empty stomach. Before an attack, one doesn't eat. If you got shot on an empty stomach, you might survive. If you were shot on a full stomach, you die in pain. Dirlewanger walked in the rear, sometimes rode in a tank, always under good cover. He rushed his men forward. Those who lagged behind were shot by him in the back. I was setting explosives under big doors somewhere in the old town. From inside we heard, "Nicht schießen! Nicht schießen!" Don't shoot. The doors opened and a nurse appeared with a tiny white flag. We went inside with fixed bayonets. A huge hall with beds and mattresses on the floor. Wounded were everywhere. Besides Poles, there were also wounded Germans. The Germans begged the SS men not to kill the Poles. A Polish officer, a doctor and 15 Polish Red Cross nurses surrendered the military hospital to us. Dirlewanger's men were following us. The SS men killed all the wounded. They were breaking their heads with rifle butts. The wounded Germans were screaming and crying in despair. After that, Dirlewanger's men ran after the nurses. They ripped their clothes off. We heard women screaming. In the evening on Adolf Hitler Square, which is Platz Pilsudskiego, there was a roar as loud as during a boxing match. Soldiers of all units, Wehrmacht, SS, Kaminsky's Cossacks, the Russian Liberation Army, boys from the Hitlerjugend, whistles, exhortations. Dirlewanger stood about with his men and laughed. The nurses from the hospital were rushed through the square, naked, with hands on their heads. Blood ran down their legs. The doctor was dragged behind them with a noose on his neck. He wore a rag, red maybe from blood, and a thorn crown on top of his head. All were led to the gallows where a few bodies were hanging already. When they were hanging one of the nurses, Dirlewanger kicked the brick she was standing on. I couldn't watch it anymore. We ran to our quarters, but before we reached them we saw Kaminsky's Cossacks rushing with civilians. We called those Cossacks the Hiwis, from Hilfswillinge, volunteers, willing to help. Next to them, a Polish pregnant woman fell down. One of the Hiwis turned back and whipped her. She tried to escape on her knees, but they killed her by trampling her with horses. We entered a school. Children were standing in the hall and on the stairs, lots of children, all with their small hands up. We looked at them for a few moments until Dirlewanger ran in. He ordered them all to be killed. They shot them when they were walking over their bodies and breaking their little heads with rifle butts. Blood streamed down the stairs. There's a memorial plaque in that place stating 350 children were killed. I think there were many more, maybe 500. Every time when we stormed the cellars and we found women inside, Dirlewanger's men raped them. Many times a group raped the same woman, quickly, still holding weapons in their hands. Then, after one of the fights, I was standing shaking by the wall and couldn't calm my nerves. Dirlewanger's men burst in. One of them took a woman. She was pretty. She wasn't screaming. Then he raped her, pushing her head strongly against the table, holding a bayonet in the other hand. First he cut open her blouse, then one cut from stomach to throat. Blood gushed. Do you know how fast blood congeals in August? I also remember a small child in Dirlewanger's hands. He took it from a woman who was standing in the crowd in the street. He lifted the child high and threw it into the fire. Then he shot the mother. We stormed a building. I ran through a field. A wounded soldier lay on the ground. I gave him some water from my canteen, then ran forward to blow up some doors. The SS moved behind us. When I ran back, Dirlewanger stopped me. He pointed to the wounded soldier. You gave water to this pig? Only then did I notice that, although wearing a German uniform, the wounded man had a dirty white-red armband. Shoot him! Dirlewanger handed me a pistol. I stood motionless, sick at all that. Dirlewanger was so furious that I couldn't understand what he was shouting. The Pole looked at me. I'll never forget his eyes. In Warsaw, I learned to recognise that a wounded person would survive for 10 minutes or maybe a couple of hours. When one sees so many people dying, you just know how long they'll live. One of Dirlewanger's SS men grabbed the gun from me and shot the Pole. Then, when some Wehrmacht soldiers appeared, he began to threaten me with a court-martial. One infantry officer started a violent discussion with him, and I ran away. The last stronghold of the uprising surrendered. Some high-ranking officer came with a white flag. We led him to our battalion commander. I saw there our Major Woldenberg, Dirlewanger and other commanders. After a couple of hours the Poles arrived, with a vast number of people following them. All the wounded were placed in a huge warehouse of a vinegar factory. We were ordered to leave. From the outside we heard screams and shots. I know what happened there. This is Wola in the west of Warsaw. At this location before the Second World War there was a park. It was a recreational area for children, a playground, I believe. After the war, this building in front of me, I believe, also had certain cult status. Perhaps it was some ice cream or something along those lines. The attack from the west, using the renegade, largely Soviet, former Soviet personnel under likes of Kaminsky and Dirlewanger, was dreadfully brutal. They killed everything, destroyed everything they could. However, it was very hot. I mean, it's very hot today. It's 31 degrees today and it's not even August yet. And then it was very hot. Lots of bodies lying out in the open. They realized they had to destroy them. Around the 8th of August 1944, they arranged what I would term an incineration squad, Verbrennungskommando. And this Verbrennungskommando was made up of 2 units, both of 50 people, approximately, Polish men who were offered the chance either to be in this unit or to be killed. And so that was what happened. They were guarded. Each unit was guarded, maybe 15, 20 SS, Gestapo, police, approximately, because it's very difficult to tell because there's very little in the way of documentary evidence, relying on people's memories, and not many people survived the Verbrennungskommando. They had a number of fires where bodies were burnt. It wasn't so difficult for them to find materials to burn the bodies. There was plenty of wood and other flammable materials lying around, so they burnt the bodies, and then what was left of the bodies, the ashes and the remains, was brought here. In many cases, the amount of burnt bodies, destroyed bodies brought here may be as many as 30,000. It's very difficult to say, though. You just cannot tell. Nobody was keeping records, and nobody was keeping records of the amount of people who were actually killed. Many of the people in these commandos were later shot, and there was all sorts of offences for which they could be shot. For example, they were ordered to report any Poles that they found, any civilians that they found. If they didn't report the civilians, they could be killed. Of course, the civilians were in hiding. They were the ones that went into the buildings which had been abandoned, well, not so much abandoned, the people had been forced out, and or they had tried to escape from the Nazis. People were taken to a church which was put up as a transit camp. Now, initially they killed everybody. However, Erich von den Bach-Zalewski ordered that when he arrived here, he'd been on holiday in Sopot, and he arrived here and he ordered that initially that women and children not be killed, and later he ordered that men not be killed too. He was thinking, of course, and what he said was that these men could be used for slave labor in the Reich, and there was probably not much point in destroying everybody when people could be used. It's not so long earlier, on the 29th of July, or 28th of July, I think it was 28th of July 1944, the Nazi authorities here, Ludwig Fischer, had ordered the population, 100,000 people, to actually appear, report for work, and dig trenches and other fortifications to stop the Soviet army. So that they would have been thinking of that as well. Having said that, the population that survived was taken to places such as that church and lots of other places as well. There they went through a sort of screening. Anybody suspected of being an insurgent or Jewish was killed immediately, and they didn't really need much reason to suspect. And other people were then sent to the transit camp at Pruszków. The amount of people who went through the camp at Pruszków is enormous. It's in hundreds of thousands. They weren't just from Warsaw, there were some areas around here. Now, today there's not a lot here to remind us that what happened here. There is a cross at the other side of the park, but that is it. And it's a cross without a description. As one comes in from the west through ulica Wolska and ulica Gorczewska, there are constant reminders of what happened here. The march of the units under Reinhardt, Dirlewanger, and what they did to the local population. So that is the new Warsaw, the skyscrapers, new buildings. That is looking towards the west. And coming up here, we have the cross. And I'll read this to you. On the 5th of August 1944, on the grounds of the nearby garden recreational area, Venezia, the Germans shot around 100 people, mainly people who lived in Wolska 28, and on the 5th and the 10th of August at Wolska 26 they murdered around 150 people. In the next days, the Verbrennungskommando, the incineration squad, burnt at this place hundreds of bodies of murdered men, women and children. In 1947, the remains of the victims were buried at the Uprising cemetery in Warsaw. When I prepared this video, I started in the west of Warsaw and wanted to follow the path of the Sonderkommando Dirlewanger through Warsaw. I was at the location of the former Venezia Park, still in Wola, where thousands of bodies were burned, when I decided that this was not the right way to do this video. I was acutely aware that I could miss one of the many massacres, and not only that, it was beginning to get monotonous. 1,000 people killed here, here 4,000, here 500. There is a principle with the death camps that either everyone's name gets mentioned or no one's does. This is how I felt here too. I did not want to run the risk of missing a location where hundreds of people died. Furthermore, there were locations where killings took place which seemed illogical with the dates that I had, and I deemed further investigation was necessary. Therefore, I've done a number of videos on individual massacres, mainly by Dirlewanger's unit, but not all of them. What to me is clear is that comparatively little fighting was done by Dirlewanger. The Wehrmacht did the fighting. Dirlewanger's role was that of causing mass terror. The same mass terror as they had done in the Lublin region and then in what is today Belarus. Himmler might have thought he was fighting, but Zalewski would have known the truth. The tens of thousands who were murdered by Dirlewanger were killed precisely because they were not fighters and couldn't defend themselves. I have no doubt that the policy of the National Socialist leadership, above all Hitler and Himmler, was to destroy as many lives as possible and the city with it. However, I also think that there was a breakdown in the German military chain of command when Reinfeldt was put in charge, as he had no experience whatsoever in such matters. When I read Norman Davies' book on the Warsaw Uprising in 2004, I found it very odd that he'd only devoted one paragraph to the Wola massacre. Having now attempted to make an account of the Dirlewanger Sonderkommando, I appreciate the difficulties he faced. The overall civilian deaths during the Warsaw Uprising comes to around 170,000 to 200,000 people. Consider that the pre-war population was around 1.3 million and a population of around 900,000 people were still in the Polish capital on the 31st of July 1944. Dirlewanger and the SS generals Erich von den Bach-Zalewski and Heinz Reinfeldt received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on the 30th of September 1944 for suppressing the uprising. All of these were long-term Nazis. One might argue that in this case the Iron Cross was awarded not for feats on the battlefield, but for killing unarmed civilians. In the autumn of 1944, the front stabilised. However, it was, as Heinz Guderian put it, a pack of cards. It would collapse the next time the Red Army pushed it, and that must have been obvious to Dirlewanger. In part 4, we shall see how the Sonderkommando Dirlewanger fared in the remainder of World War II, including looking at its recruitment problems in the autumn of 1944 and deployment to Slovakia, Hungary, and finally to the front in the Gumen sector on the river Neisse.